in and out of the Beltway. From large cities to small towns to the rural heartland. From sea to shining sea. This is Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio. Inside the News.
Welcome back to this week's edition of Inside the News. So glad to have you. And there's so much to talk about. We sometimes don't even know where to start, but we do have to get started. We've got Ben Brunson and we have Frank Vernuccio. How are you today, Ben?
I'm doing just great. It's a pleasure to be with both of you once again.
Yes, and I am so fortunate that I'm amongst you guys with the Brain Trust. How you doing up there, Frank? And what state are you in this week?
The demented state of New York.
He's just going down the dictionary under what matches. What do you think about that one, Ben?
Very appropriate is what I think.
Very, very, very appropriate. All right, let's get started on this. And I tell you, I'm watching what happened over the weekend, and everybody's heart got sick a little bit when Trump went into the hospital when they said he had COVID-19. And then the backlash, and I just couldn't believe how indecent the left was. I mean, we all knew that they hated Trump, but Frank, they went overboard, didn't they?
Well, they certainly did. And of course, not everyone was heartsick when Trump had to report to the hospital with COVID. The fact of the matter is there was a time in American history when the parties and the interests could come together and say, at least we wish our opponents, even if it was not your party, well, good health and all that. That did not occur. Indeed, some of the reporting on CNN and MSNBC could only be described as gleeful with the news of President Trump's COVID infection. And of course, the fact that this is run through the White House, apparently it has become a COVID hotspot, delighted a number of people. I just wanted to point out, and I'm going to speak a bit more to this in my my hot button topic, but Chris Murphy, senator from the state of Connecticut, made a statement that the press has not reviewed in detail, and indeed it should. Chris Murphy, Senator Murphy, said, now that President Trump is incapacitated, Vladimir Putin will have to take over his campaign. Now, clearly the statement is not only demented, but it is also a vicious statement after we've had 3 years of an investigation that showed not only no relation between President Trump and Vladimir Putin, but in fact it was Hillary Clinton that apparently had some dealings with the Russians on this. For a United States senator to make a comment like that just beggars belief. And the fact that the press essentially has covered up that irrational, demented statement tells you a lot about the state of the media in 2020.
You know, seeing that we're playing these games with first letters, and when Frank said gleeful, I almost thought of the word ghoulish might have been more of the word, because they are truly off the ledge here. Well, if they were on the ledge, they're probably pretty much falling off, aren't they, Ben?
Well, Trump had the temerity of actually disproving the narrative that was set up all weekend long. So if you watch the left stream media all weekend, all you heard was what grave danger Donald Trump was in because he's old and obese and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, basically the narrative was he'll be lucky if he survives this. And when Donald Trump returned triumphantly to the White House on Monday, and every indication is that he looks great. He's taken a cocktail of different therapeutic drugs. Some are very new, not even officially approved yet, but he got them on a compassionate use basis, which is perfectly legitimate, done all the time for drugs that are in development and undergoing clinical trials that have had very positive results in those clinical trials. They are allowed to be used prior to official approval. So the president destroyed their narrative, and of course the president seemingly having a fairly easy, and look, there can be relapse, there can be, he can take a negative turn, but he seemingly has had a very easy go of it, which by the way matches some of my experience in my family with older family members who were in their 70s who had really nothing more than a bad flu when they came down with COVID. It just destroys the entire narrative that the press has been setting up. And in fact, the entire narrative that we have based the shutdown of the Western economy on, that this is a deadly pathogen that's going to wreak havoc on everybody who contracts it. And unfortunately, there's a good chunk of our country that believes it's essentially a death knell if you come down with COVID. The reality is completely different, and we're getting more and more data all the time that shows this is essentially no different than the flu. And the data is becoming quite overwhelming. So the left is now the ones who completely ignore all of the science. We'll talk more about it as we go forward, but the science is quite compelling and overwhelming. We need to open up our economy completely. We need to stop the insanity that this has become. And of course, at this point, it's a completely politically driven narrative in an attempt to ensure that Donald Trump loses on November 3rd.
Ben, before I go back to Frank, and you're familiar with clinical trials and all, Trump was the one who said on these drugs and treatments, there ought to be the right to try. And that's what he basically, kind of showed to the nation over the weekend.
Well, that's right. That right does exist. Again, the FDA has a compassionate use exemption on a drug that is not formally approved yet. That's nothing new. That wasn't created just for Donald Trump or Donald Trump's insistence. That has existed for decades. That's standard. And the therapeutics that he took while he was at Walter Reed fell into that compassionate use exemption. His physicians were comfortable that they were safe for him to take. The evidence suggests that indeed there are no harmful side effects, and indeed they've had a positive palliative impact on the president's health, which is a good thing.
Frank, I'm going to go back to you now. And, talking about the drugs and what's going on here, Deborah Birx, she was raised to the front of everything back in the early part of this year, 2020. And I contended even back then that she was more into the testing, into the data, and she was one of these nerds that just dug in and loved it. And she kept praising the University of Washington, which was a Bill Gates organization. I mean, he's not the university, but Bill and the Bill Gates Foundation funded a lot of those Murray studies out there in Washington. And Birx was just touting it just because she loved the data and having charts and graphs and everything. Well, if Trump is getting healthy, and if the American people are seeing that they can live beyond coronavirus, they don't need the charts and the graphs, and basically puts these people out of their fun time of datas and graphs.
Well, of course, any crisis produces institutions that are going to make some money off it, that are going to get into the limelight. But what I find fascinating is that as this campaign goes forward, and as we come into the closing weeks of the election of 2020, the reality that it was in January of this year that Joe Biden and the Democrat leadership essentially ignored this crisis and said that Donald Trump was being racist and xenophobic for closing down travel from China, that in local governments like here in New York City, where we were told to ignore COVID, we were told to go back into those crowded subways and back into the crowded buses and to resume normal activities or to continue normal activities. Somehow that reality has been all but dismissed by the press. You hear nothing of it whatsoever. I was rather stunned when Chris Wallace, during the presidential debate, really did not touch that issue in the slightest. Clearly, it was an explosive mistake on the part of the Democrat leadership, and yet Chris Wallace, despite his protestations of neutrality, did his best to ignore that fact.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Ben, you brought this up in pre-production. I think it was you talking about the WHO, and not the rock band, but the World Health Organization, and that their numbers were way off about reality.
Well, let me add one point to what Frank just said. The irony of all of this is that the position that the Democrats and the mayor of New York and the governors all had back in March was actually the right position. We should have kept the economy open. Sweden, which kept their economy open, looks better by the day. Sweden has a new daily infection rate of about 200 cases.
So they took a hit back then, but now they're coming out of it better.
They took the hit back then. They had more cases per capita because they kept their economy open. Their death rate is among the better in Europe. So their death rate is not as good as Germany, but much better than the UK, Italy, and Spain. And now they're great. They essentially have a normally functioning economy. Few people wear masks in Sweden. If you go there, it looks like Europe did a year ago instead of the way most of Europe looks like today, which is borders on being a ghost town as countries like the UK and Spain are going back into lockdown. So the Swedish model has proven to be absolutely the right model, and we should have followed it. Now, to add to the story, that's before we talk about the World Health Organization. Dr. Michael Ryan, the head of emergencies for the WHO, in an official session that included the director of the WHO and all the senior personnel, stated that according to WHO records and analysis, they believe up to 10% of the global population has actually been infected with this disease.
Would it be 700 million?
That would be 750 million plus people. That's the World Health Organization official assessment at this point. It is totally ignored in the press because there are huge implications of that. What it means is that the death rate, which we know is quite low, is in fact much lower than we thought, and on par with the regular flu. This is really no different than the regular flu. We have shut down our economy. The West has shut down its economy and imposed a Great Depression era impact on the West for the flu. And it's ongoing. It's crazy. And the World Health Organization numbers are absolutely critical. The official infected rate is 35 million. The reality is closer to 750 million. That means the death rate is dramatically lower and really no different than the flu at all.
You know something, Frank? The World Health Organization, the WHO, they were covering up for China, saying, this is, and what they did back in 9 months, 10 months ago. And now all of a sudden they're saying, oh, this thing is really bad. And now they're doing a 180 degrees on this thing, Frank.
Yeah, they certainly are. And of course, it brings up the question once again of the integrity and the usefulness of the United Nations. The setup is dramatically a problem for all of us. Back when the United Nations was started, it had a goal. The goal was defeating the fascist countries of Germany and Japan. It has lost its way. The structure does not make any sense. Many across the world are beginning to believe, or have believed for some time as well, that an organization which is based on democratic principles, small d democratic, of course, needs to replace or at least supplement the United Nations. The way the Security Council members have a veto, particularly when those Security Council members are defiant of the very principles upon which the United Nations was founding, makes that organization essentially useless.
He brings up the United Nations. Frank brings that up, Ben. And it reminded me of that Mel Gibson movie where the guys hold up and he says, I have diplomatic immunity. That's all the United Nations is. It's like a license to do illegal stuff. And then Danny Glover comes in and goes, been revoked. And it's like United Nations is not worth anything to the United States anymore.
Well, it's rarely been worth anything to the United States. It had a noble concept following World War II. It was, of course, the follow-on to the League of Nations, which was developed after World War I. But, of course, the noble goal is to avoid World War III and to stop wars in general. That's the primary purpose the United Nations exists. That's great. But, of course, like everything else, it has evolved into just a massive bureaucratic organization in which people go there, they have lifelong careers, they get wealthy, they do nothing. It's like every government agency there is. They have very little impact on anything. Occasionally the UN does some good work in distributing food and addressing famines around the world, but they have as much bad. There are sex scandals involved with UN operations around the world. Some are hideous in terms of child sex trafficking and all sorts of things that UN workers have been accused of. So, it's becoming a very anti-Semitic organization. So at this point, frankly, on balance, I'd say it does a lot more harm than it does good.
All right, this is Inside the News. Glad that you are watching us on AUN TV and on YouTube and listening to us on SoundCloud and our affiliates all across the country. Thank you so much, Frank Vernuccio. He's with the American Analysis of News and Media, usagovpolicy.com. Ben Brunson, he's the author of the Falstaff, Enigma, and Esther, Sling. You can find his books at Amazon and benbrunson.com. We're going to take our first time out, and we're going to be talking about Azerbaijan. Yeah, I actually said the word. I want to find out what it's about. We'll be back.
You're listening to Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio, Inside the News.